Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. But it's more fun to talk about unexpected than inclusion or diversity, although it is relevant to talk about both of those. And our guest today is Fred Dummar. It is pronounced Dummar or Dummar?
Dummar.
Dummar. See, I had to do that. So, Fred is a person I met about 7 or 8 months ago through Susy Flory, who was my co-author on Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at ground zero. And Susy introduced us because Fred is writing a book. We're going to talk about that a bunch today. And um, we'll also talk about Fred's career and all sorts of other things like that. But we've had some fascinating discussions. And now we finally get to record a podcast. So I'm glad to do that. So, Fred Dummar, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Michael. And yeah, we've had some interesting discussions about everything unstoppable mind and blindness and diversity. And yeah, it's good to be on here.
Yeah. And one of the things I know that you have done is ran with a blind marathoner, and I'm anxious to hear about that as well as what an ultra marathon is. We'll get to that, however. But why don't we start by you maybe talking a little bit about kind of the early Fred growing up and all that. You grew up in Nevada in a kind of remote place, so I'm going to just leave it to you to talk about all that.
Yeah, Michael. So, and actually, that's part of my story that I'm writing about because, you know, obviously where we're from forms a large basis of how we sometimes interact with the world. And I came from a very remote town in Nevada. It's dying, by the way. I'm not sure how long that town will be with us. But yeah, being from a small town where, graduating class was 13 kids and it's an hour to the closest place that you could watch a movie or get fast food, those types of things. It's definitely a different type of childhood and much more grounded in self-reliance and doing activities that you can make up yourself, right? Instead of being looking for others to entertain you.
Yeah, I hear you. So, what was it like growing up in a small town? I grew up in Palmdale, California, so it was definitely larger than where you grew up. We had a fairly decent size high school senior graduating class. It wasn't 13, but what was it like growing up in that kind of environment?
Yeah, it was one where not only did you know everybody, everybody else knew you, and so you could pretty much um, count on anyone in the town for assistance, or if I guess if you were on the outs for not assistance. So, but no, it was a great place. Still have many friends from there, but it was certainly was an adjustment because I think growing up there, our sort of outlook on life for us, certainly from the people that ran our high school and the other adults. Most people were seen as, your life after high school would be going to work at one of the mines or going to work on one of the, family cattle ranch or something like that. So making the jump from there to, even a few hours away to Reno, to start at the University of Nevada, that was a big jump for me. And because the school was so small, I ended up graduating from high school when I was 16. So I barely had a driver's license, and now I am several hours away in Reno, Nevada, going to the university, and quite an adjustment for me.
It's interesting. A few days ago, I had the opportunity to do a podcast episode with someone who's very much involved and knows a lot about bullying and so on. And just listening to you talk, it would seem like you probably didn't have a whole lot of the bully type mentality because everyone was so close and everyone kind of interacted with each other. So probably that sort of stuff wasn't tolerated very well.
Yeah, it was more so outsiders. I mean,
Yeah.
kids that had grown up there, all sort of knew where they were or weren't in the pecking order of things, and things sort of stayed kind of at a steady stasis without a lot of bullying. But yeah, new kids coming in, that's where you would see, for me, from my recollection of growing up there, that's where, I remember that type of behavior coming out when,
Mm.
a new kid would come into the town.
Was it mainly from the new kids or from the kids who were already there?
From the kids, sometimes it was the integration, right?
Yeah,
Some people integrate into new environments better than others, and generally no problems for those folks. But some, it takes a bit more. And in a place like that, you know, if you're seen as different, so to your theory on or your, the topics you cover on diversity and inclusion, sometimes when you're the one that looks different or acts different in an environment like that, you
that has
definitely
to be a
stick
problem.
out, and
Yeah.
then become the target of bullying.
What what happens that changes that for a kid then? So you're different or in one way or another, but what happens that gets kids accepted, or do they?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's learning to embrace just who you are and doing your own thing. I
Got it.
think if you're trying to force yourself into an environment that doesn't want to accept you, I'm not sure that that's ever an easy battle for anyone. But just being yourself and doing your own thing, I think that's the way to go. And that's certainly, what I learned through my life was I wasn't one of the kids that planned on staying there and working in the mine, and I wasn't, my family was, you know, at that point, my mom and dad owned the only grocery store in town, and I certainly wasn't going back to run the family business. So, looking for a way, for something else to do outside of that small town was certainly number one on my agenda, getting out of there. So, being myself and learning to adapt, or as the saying goes, right, learning to be, instead of being a fish in a small pond, learning to be a fish in a much larger pond.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of growth that has to take place for that to occur, but it's understandable. So you
Yeah.
graduated at 16, and then what did you do?
After my freshman year at college, which I funded by, you know, uh, sort of misleading people, or lying about my age so that I could get a job at 16 and working construction and as an apprentice electrician. And that funded my freshman year of college. But, as my freshman year was dragging on, I was wondering, hey, how I was going to continue to fund my, continued my stay at the university, because I did not want to go, back home,
Right.
sort of defeated by that. So I started looking into various military branches of military service, and that's when I happened upon the National Guard, Nevada National Guard. And so I joined the National Guard, and right after, I think it was 5 days after I turned 17. So as soon as I could, I signed up. And that summer, after my freshman year, I left for training for the National Guard. Missed first semester of my sophomore year, but then came back and continued on with my university studies using, my the educational benefits that came from being in the National Guard.
So you were in the National Guard, but that wasn't a full-time thing, so you were able to go back and continue education?
Yeah, yeah. It was, it's a typical 1 weekend a month.
Got it.
1 weekend a month for duty. Typically, we would go in on a Friday night, spend Saturday and Sunday for duty. So we'd get a, small check for that, and then we were also allowed to draw, the GI Bill. And the state of Nevada had a program at the time where you didn't get paid up front for your classes, but at the end of every semester, you could take your final report card, and for every class, for every credit that you had a C or higher, they would reimburse you.
Ooh,
So
okay.
yeah, so they were essentially paying my tuition, and then small stipend every month from the GI Bill, and then my National Guard check. So, and in the '80s, when I was going to school, that was enough to keep to fund my education.
And where did you go to school?
At the University of Nevada in Reno.
In Reno. Okay.
Yeah.
So so you kind of have ended up really liking Reno, huh?
Yeah, I became sort of home city Obviously, no one would ever really know where I, if I would have mentioned that I grew up in a town called Gabbs, most people would, not really understand. I
Right.
sometimes if they, press and say, hey, where are you really? Because, I often say, hey, I went to school in Reno. And if they say, where did you grow up? And
Yeah.
it's a longer conversation. I'll be like, okay, so if you put your finger like right in the middle of Nevada, in the absolute middle of nowhere, that's where I grew up.
Uh, well, people need to recognize and accept people for who they are, and that doesn't always happen, which is never fun, but you got
Yeah.
to do what you can do.
Yes.
Well, so um, Reno, on the other hand, is a much larger town, and probably you're a whole lot more comfortable there than you were in Gabs, but that's okay. So
Yes.
you went to the university, you got a bachelor's,
Yep.
and then what did you do?
Yeah. Well, so along the way, while I was in the National Guard, being a medic,
Right.
I was convinced by a lieutenant that met me. I was actually doing the physical because that was one of the things our section did when I was first in. We gave the medical physicals, and this lieutenant said, you should come transfer to our unit. The unit was an infantry unit, and I became their only medic, and so that was much better than working in a medical section for a helicopter unit where I'd been, and and the lieutenants, said that I should consider joining ROTC since I was already going to the university. So I did in my junior year, started the Reserve Officer Training Corps there at the University of Nevada. And so when I graduated college in the winter of '89, I accepted a commission into the Army. And so then a few months later, I was off on my grand Army adventure.
All right. And then what did you do?
So yeah, that was, because it was an infantry lieutenant, went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and I believe now the Army calls it Fort Moore.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I trained there for about a year doing all of the tasks necessary to become an infantry officer. And then I went down to Panama when the U.S. still had forces in the country of
Ah,
Panama. And I spent 2.5 years down there
was that
in
post
Panama.
Noriega?
Yeah, yeah, right after, because I had graduated from college in December of '89 while Operation Just Cause to get rid of Noriega was happening. So a year after my infantry training, I sort of ended up in Panama and sort of as at the time thinking it was bad luck, because if you're in the Army, you kind of want to go where things are happening. So I'm in Panama the year after the invasion while Saddam Hussein is invading
Yeah.
Kuwait and everyone else is rushing to the desert and I'm sitting in the jungle. So, as a young person, you start to think, hey, I'm missing the big war and I'm in the army.
Yeah.
I should be at the war. So that was an interesting take. Not one I would have now, but, as a young man,
What what
that's,
what caused you to revise that view though? Or was it just
yeah,
time?
yeah, just time and,
Yeah.
later in life, after serving combat rotations in Iraq and Afghanistan, I realized it wasn't something one needed to rush towards.
Wasn't
That,
really quite so bad where you were.
yeah. So, yeah, I spent a couple years in Panama. Then I came back to Fort Benning, Fort Moore, and worked at the Army's Airborne School. So, uh, the place that teaches people how to jump out of airplanes, and I did
Right.
that for for a year. So it's really fun because watching people go through the process of training to jump out of an aircraft, and then sort of their very first time on an aircraft when it takes off. And you can see sort of the realization that they're not going to land with the plane for the first time in their life. They're not going to be in the plane when it
Yeah.
lands. That's always, it's always a good time. And then, of course, when, then there's another realization moment when the doors pop open, right? And the doors on the aircraft are opened, so the jump
And
masters can start making checks,
and
and
you're looking out.
yeah, and they're looking, and their eyes get larger and larger, as preparations for the jump, when they're stood up and they're hooked up inside the aircraft, and then finally, told to exit.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And during the time when I worked there, that's when I was eligible because I was a senior lieutenant at that time that I could apply to become a Green Beret. I could go through Special Forces training if I was selected. So I left from Fort Benning. I went up to Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, and um, went through the selection, Special Forces assessment and selection, and was selected to become a Special Forces soldier. So then I went to Fort Bragg, spent the year or so becoming qualified to be a Special Forces team leader. And then I spent the next 20 years of my Army career in various units at Fort Liberty and 3rd Special Forces Group, Special Forces Command, 7th Special Forces Group, Special Operations Recruiting, just, bouncing around to different assignments. And then but obviously during that time, 9/11 happened, and was on the initial invasion in 2003 up into the north. We were flying in from Romania, before the war started, and so being there during that phase of the Iraq combat in Iraq, and then going to Afghanistan and spending multiple tours and multiple years in Afghanistan. So.
So, did you do much jumping out of airplanes?
Yeah, in combat, no. But over the years, yeah, I
Yeah.
accumulated quite a few jumps because every unit I was ever assigned to while I was in the Army was always one that was, airborne, which are, the designation for units that jump out of
So
airplanes.
you
So
have
yeah,
to, yeah.
yeah.
Well, you're a pretty level-headed kind of guy. What was it like the first time you jumped? I mean, you described what it looked like to other people. Do you think that was basically the same for you, or did you
Yeah, yeah, I
develop
think
any
that
kind
was
of a thicker skin?
yeah, no, I think that's why I was able to, I think in large measure, that's how a lot of us are able to have empathy, right? If we've been through it and we are able to access the memory of, okay, what was it like when I was doing it? Um, it allows us to be, more compassionate to the people that are going through it at that moment for the first time. But yeah, I can remember being in the plane and then, that realization is like, hey, the pit of your stomach.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not landing with this plane.
Yeah.
and and then the doors opening up and you're like kind of hey, those, I don't know what the gates of hell look like, but right now that's in my mind what they would look like. And then uh going out the first time, and then I think the second time might have been worse because it was the anticipation of, oh, wait a minute, we're doing that again. And and you do 5 jumps to qualify before you're given your parachute as badge. So I think by the third one, I'd come to terms with dealing and managing, um, the fear of it, of leaving an airplane. And people, often ask, when you're older and you're past the 100 jump mark, it's
Yeah.
like, is there still fear? And I'm like, I think if there's not, I mean, then there's probably something wrong with you.
Yeah.
but but it's nowhere near how it is when you're first learning and you're first learning to trust yourself and trust the equipment and trust the process.
Well, what you're learning a little bit along the way is to how to control fear. And
Yeah,
you mentioned my book earlier, the one that's coming out, Live Like a Guide Dog, which is all about trying to teach people to control fear because we have so many things happen to us, or we think about so many things that we develop so many fears, consciously or not, that when something does unexpectedly happen to us, especially something that isn't necessarily a positive thing, we just automatically go into a fear reaction mode. And
yeah,
the reality is it doesn't need to be that way. You can learn to control fear, which is what we talk about in Live Like a Guide Dog, because it's important that people recognize you can learn to control fear. I would never say don't be afraid,
yeah,
but I think you can learn to control fear. And by doing so, then you use that fear to help guide you and give you the tools to really be able to move forward and focus. Um, but most people don't really spend much time doing that. They don't learn introspection. They don't learn how to slow down and analyze and develop that mind muscle so that later you can analyze
Yeah.
incredibly quickly.
Yeah. We in the Army, we call that stress inoculation.
Good description.
It's you've learned to deal with stress or deal with, stressful, fearful um, things, then the next time you're better equipped. And that fear and that stress can be continually amped up. I used to laugh when I was doing special forces recruiting because it would require a special physical for candidates to go get a special physical before they could come to training. And one of the boxes we would joke about was, um, I have no fear of heights or enclosed spaces.
Yeah.
But everybody has those fears. It's whether you can manage those fears and deal with you know things that
Well,
are very uncomfortable.
that's really it. It's all about managing. And so I'm sure that they want you to check no, that you don't have those fears
Yeah,
when you're going through. But at the same time, what you're hopefully really saying is you can manage it.
yeah, I could. Yeah, that you can manage it, and that's why I was saying. That's why I would always laugh because, of course, everyone has those fears, and but learning to deal with them and how you deal with them, and that's one of the things I discuss in one of the chapters of the book I'm writing is um, when fear comes to you, how do you deal with it, and how do you overcome it? And I think people are more and more recognizing, that there are techniques through stress inoculation, things like that. They'll teach you how you can overcome fear and, simple breathing techniques to,
Right.
slow down your breathing and engage your brain. Not just your brain stem, right?
Right.
When you breathe it fast, your brain stem is in charge, not your brain. And yeah, and think your way through things rather than just reacting as a frightened animal.
Right. And it's one of the things that as I discuss in the book and I talk to people about now a lot is that although I didn't realize it for many years after September 11th, I had developed a mindset on that day that said, you know what to do, because I had spent a lot of time learning what to do, how to deal with emergencies, what the rules were, and all that. And all of that just kicked in on September 11th, which is as good as it could get.
Yeah. Well, Michael, you have a distinct advantage. You had a distinct advantage, a couple of them, but one being, because you already live in a world without light in your sight, you're not dependent on on that. And so when other people are when I'm reading the book, I'm nodding my head knowingly, as you're talking about being in the stairwell and other people being frightened, and you're just like, this is okay. This is an average. I mean, maybe unusual circumstances, but an average day for me
Yeah, but
going
the
out.
other side of it is I know lots of blind people who would be just as much in fear as anyone else. It's the fact is, of course, we didn't know what was going on
Yes.
September 11th.
In that
And
case, a bit of ignorance is bliss, right?
yeah, and that was true for everyone. I had a great imagination. I could tell you that I imagined things that could happen that were a whole lot worse than, in a sense, what did. But I like science fiction and horror, so I learned how to imagine well. But the fact is that it isn't so much being blind that's an advantage. It really was the preparation. And
Yeah.
so the result was that I had done that. And, of course, the airplane hit 18 floors above us on the other side of the building. So the reality is going down the stairs, none of us knew what happened.
Yeah.
We figured out an airplane hit the building because we started smelling the fumes from burning jet fuel. But by the same token, um, that was all we knew. We didn't even know the tower two had been hit until, well, much later when we got outside. Colleagues saw, David Frank, my colleague, saw tower two was on fire, but we still didn't know what it was from. So
Yeah.
the fact is that blindness may or may not really be an advantage, but preparation certainly was.
Yeah. How
And
you reacted, to being blind. Because yeah, you can just
well,
like anything, right? You can react in several different ways, and how you
well,
reacted, how you built your life around the
sure.
way
And
you.
most people, of course, just rely on reading signs. And So they also have the fear, what if I can't read the signs? What if there's smoke and all that? And again, they build fears rather than doing the smart thing, which is just to learn what to do in the case of an emergency when you're in a building like that. But it is part of what we do talk about, and it is pretty important that people start to learn a little bit more that they can control fear. I mean, we have in our whole world politicians who just do nothing but promote fear, and that's unfortunate because we all buy into it rather than stepping back and go, wait a minute, it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, like you talked about your preparation and training, and I always that was one of the ways, or one of the things that brought me to ultra marathoning. After my
Yeah,
initial training in special forces was, if you're going to push your capacity, to see, what you're really capable of, or build additional reserves. So, if you are counted on to do something um, extraordinary or in extenuating circumstances, what do you really have?
yeah,
How far can you really push yourself? And so it really brought me into the sport of ultra running, where the distances are those distances that exceed a marathon. So
yeah.
a marathon being 26
26
miles.
miles.
Yeah. So the first ultra marathon is a 50K, because marathon is 42, so 8 kilometers farther, and then the next general uh, length is 50 miles, and then there's some other 100K, which is 62 miles, and then kind of although now you see races longer, but kind of the longest distance being a 100 mile
Mm,
race. And so, and the gold standard in 100 mile racing being, for most courses, every course being different, but for most courses is to finish under 24 hours. So within one day, but to keep moving for one entire day,
yeah.
while fueling yourself, and some people would say, well, wow, that pace doesn't seem that fast.
Try it
And
yourself then and see. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and like a lot of things, it doesn't exactly seem fast until you're factoring in, okay, but you're still going to have to stop at some point to relieve yourself, and you're going to have to walk while you eat, and there's hills to climb, and all these other sorts of obstacles. So yeah, finishing under 24 hours is sort of the standard, I guess, for the people want to achieve. And anyway, yeah, I became for a bit there became addicted to it, and then so when I met Ivan, my friend who you were talking about, who was blinded in Iraq in 2006, when I met him, he had already been injured, and I realized that he really wanted to run marathons. He'd run one and had to use like several different guides.
Right.
There were different people jumping in and out, and it really wasn't an ideal situation for
No.
him. And he also needed someone who wanted to do that, who would be a reliable training partner, right? Because it's not like, okay, you might be able to find people that show up on marathon day who want to run the marathon, or a few people, but day in, day out to be training. And so I was like, hey, this is one of those things that ends up in your path, right? That maybe you can walk around it. But for me, when I saw it, I was like, okay, this was something that, for whatever reason is on my path. I'm meant to do it. I'm meant to be the guy that does this. And so, yeah, we started training together, and, ended up running 40 plus marathons
Wow.
together, from London, Chicago, every the Marine Corps marathon, just everywhere. And, summiting Mount Kilimanjaro, and running with the bulls together. And then our last race was, it's often referred to as, the world's toughest foot race. It's the Marathon des Sables, and it's a distance race of 150 some miles across the Sahara Desert, and they break it up into stages. So on different days, some days you run 30 miles, some days, 26. One day is a 50, I think we ran 53 miles on one of the days. But anyway, and you start that race with whatever you're going to eat and whatever you're going to need, in terms of gear on your back, and the
Mm,
only thing that's provided to you during the race is water.
was water.
So, and that was our kind of, he's like, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to run, and so I just want to do that before I stop. I stop
Yeah.
running. So, but anyway, yeah. So that was how I ended up meeting my friend Ivan, and over the course of a decade and a half, we did all of these, what some people think are incredibly dumb things, but sort of embracing the discomfort of training and competing to make ourselves better.
Yeah. So while you were in the military, I know you mentioned earlier something about doing some work in as a medic. Did you do that most of your time? Were you specializing in that or what?
No, no, that was only when early on when I was
Early
an
on.
soldier. I was a medic, and then when I was commissioned as an infantry officer, and
Okay.
then when it became special forces, the officer is sort of has no specialty other than leading the team. The team has medics and weapons guys and engineers and communicators and all that, but the officer is sort of assigned as the planning agent, to lead the team rather than have any of the specialties.
Right. And you participated long enough that you rose to the rank of colonel.
Yeah, yeah. My participation trophy was attaining the rank of colonel, and I would often tell people, the army don't think the army doesn't have a sense of humor. I was promoted to colonel on April 1st, so April Fool's Day is when when I was promoted. Um, and yeah, and I after almost 30 years in uniform, retired in 2015. So I don't know that I would have went that long, but there about the middle of my career from 1986 to 2015, 9/11 happened.
Mm.
And for me, it wasn't really a choice to leave then. It was like, okay, we have to do this, these Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, my last year in uniform, I was in Afghanistan as an advisor to the Afghan commandos. And when I returned from that tour, was told that, hey, I had to finally leave Fort Bragg after 20 years, and either go to the Pentagon or to another headquarters. And that's when I just decided to retire, because it was like, okay, if the wars don't need me anymore, then I can go home.
Yeah. And do other things.
Yeah, I can do other things. If the wars don't need me, then I can probably hang it up.
So when did you get married?
So over the course of my Army career, I was divorced twice.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it's just not an easy.
No, it's not.
It's
I
just
can
not an easy
understand.
lifestyle. I'm not making any excuses for my own failings in that regard, but it is I think easier to become emotionally detached from someone,
Yeah.
especially as in my case. I think I often put the Army first, the Army, my soldiers, the mission, is the first on my mind, and for someone else, you have to be a pretty strong person to sit in the back seat.
Yeah.
During that. So, and I did not have any children. And then, but after I retired, went through my second divorce, I met someone, and so yeah, we were married in 2020, and so I was able, after not having children, um, uh, my first son was born when I was 50. So I have a son who's 4 years old, four going on five. And then we decided that, he should have someone to be with. So we were going to have a second child, and my wife had twins. So I have twin 3-year-old girls. So yeah,
Well,
I'm
as long as you're gonna do it, you might as well go all the way, huh?
yeah, and I haven't and I adopted Rebecca's older the child that she had, and so now we have four children. Alana being much older, she's already finished her freshman year at the University of Michigan,
Ah,
and is getting ready to go back to Ann Arbor and continue her studies. And then we have, the small pack of humans that are still here in their pre-kindergarten phase. So
so
yeah.
she is a Wolverine fan and ne'er will ever be an Ohio State Buckeye.
Yeah, that's something like that. Yeah, that rivalry is pretty intense, and never being part of a school that was in that division, not really realizing. Well, watching college football, I kind of understand all the rivalries, but once she started going to Michigan and attending a football game there myself, and then unfortunately, we were able to go to the Rose Bowl
Mm,
this year, which when Michigan played Alabama, so we
yeah,
were able to go to that together. So yeah, uh, it's interesting to learn that dynamic, and like I tell her, it's like never take for granted being part of a big school like that without those sorts of traditions. Because
absolutely.
yeah,
I went to UC Irvine, so we didn't really have a lot with football, but my wife did her graduate work at USC.
yeah,
And I always like to listen to USC football games. I judge a lot about sports teams by the announcers they hire, I gotta say. And and
yeah,
so we've been always so blessed out here in California, although I think that announcing isn't quite what it used to be. But we had uh, good announcers that announced for USC out here on, I think it was originally on KNX, and then it went to other stations. But anyway, when we got married, the wedding started late because a bunch of people were sitting out in their cars waiting for the end of the USC Notre Dame game. And so the wedding was 15 minutes late starting because everybody was waiting to see who was going to win the game. And I am quite pleased to say that we won and God was on our side as opposed to Notre Dame. And, the
yeah,
marriage lasted 40 years. So until she passed away in 2022. But I love to tell people that, God clearly was on our side, especially
yeah,
when I tell that to my Notre Dame friends.
yeah. The touchdown Jesus wasn't there for them.
Not that day.
Yeah,
But and there's college football is in a lot of ways I just think so much more fun, or it has been, than professional. But now a lot more money's getting into it, which is unfortunate too.
yeah. I think that's caused some of the you know teams to reevaluate what they do and how they operate, and I think it's forced some of the older coaches to leave the game
Yeah,
because it's not the game they recognize. So
not what they had. Well, so you've been to a variety of different places. You've been a leader, and I think it's pretty clear that you really still are. But how did all the different experiences, the different places that you went to, and all the experiences that you participated in, how does that affect and shape your leadership style?
yeah, Michael, I think one of the first things, right, if you when you're surface looking, and some people never go below the surface. So when you talk about things like diversity and inclusion,
Yeah,
the things the things that they will think about that make people diverse are not generally what I think about. Um, because when you look below the surface, you see a lot of commonalities in the human experience. From my time living in Panama and operating in Central and South America, some countries in the Caribbean when I was first in special operations, and then obviously I went and did some time in Africa, some peacekeeping operations in Nigeria, some other exercises down in the South, southern countries in Africa, and then my time in Iraq and Afghanistan. People, they come in different colors. They have different their path to God or the universe or the higher power that they recognize, that the cultural artifacts that they use may look different, um, but they're generally pointing, if you can step aside from your own
yeah,
preconceived notions about things, you can see that they're just different signposts to the same God, right? To the
right.
same power, to the same things, and people want the same things, for their families, for security and prosperity, and that sort of thing. So that's where I kind of came to my leadership philosophy, which is pretty easy to remember. It's just lead with love, and if you use and I would tell people it doesn't really matter what denomination you are. If you read the Gospels of the New Testament purely as a leadership guide, it's hard to find a better leadership example than what Jesus was doing. The way he was serving others, the way he was leading. Uh, it's pretty powerful stuff. And even at the end, right during the Last Supper, when he tells people, who's the most important? Is the most important person the person sitting at the table getting ready to eat, or the person serving? And of course, as humans, is based on our, the way we think about the world. We think the most important person is, not only the person sitting at the table, but the person at the nicest table or the head of the
Yeah,
table, and not the person serving.
right.
And so that was something I tried to embrace during my time in the military. And what I try and embrace now is, being the person that serves others and using your position. If and when you are promoted or asked to lead, that you approach it from a position of, what can I do from this position to help other people, and just be compassionate to their actual circumstances. And that doesn't mean, when people hear me say that, they think, well, that's pretty. How does that reconcile with you being a Green Beret and being around, a bunch of, meat eating savages? How do you reconcile that? And like, well, leading with care and compassion doesn't mean, that I'm coddling anyone, because I'm certainly not coddling anyone. I demand high performance from myself and from people in those positions, like that, when I was a member of a special forces organization. But not everybody's supposed to be doing that. And so I think recognizing the circumstances and the people, and what the organization is supposed to do, and how it can care for people. I think those are things that became really, really important to me.
Well, and I think you raised some really valid points. The reality is that September 11th, for example, was not a religious war, a religious event. It was a bunch of thugs who wanted to have their way with the world, but most people who truly practice the Islamic faith are the same as the rest of us, and they seek God just like we do, like Jewish people do, and others do, and we've got to keep that in mind. But it's so hard, because we mostly don't step back and evaluate that and realize that those 19 people on those 4 airplanes are just a bunch of thugs, pure and simple.
Yeah, that yeah, that and the organizations they represent
Right.
are, they're and they're not the only ones, right? People of all faiths have harnessed, their
Oh, we could go
various.
back to the Crusades.
Yeah, yeah. Their various religions have harnessed themselves up to sway people to hate, or to engage in combat or whatever. So yeah, to lump that all in, and I think our some of our responses, and then also some of the way people think, has really led us to a more divided world
Yeah.
than a more inclusive, and and thinking of ourselves as one. We think of ourselves as, many and different, and sometimes things that we think would bring us together, or help us make things more fair, like, talking about diversity and inclusion. If aren't really thinking about what we're trying to do, and what that looks like, we can end up making the world more divided, and less inclusive.
And unfortunately, we're seeing way too much of that, and it isn't helping to do that. Um, and hopefully, at some point, we'll figure that out, or we'll realize that maybe it's a little bit better, or can be a little bit better than we think.
Yeah.
And I know you in 2003 did a lot to help the Kurds in northern Iraq, right?
Yeah, that was primarily, my experience in Iraq was, before the 2003 invasion. I was in Romania with my special forces company, and yeah, we flew into northern Iraq and linked up with a group of Kurds. And from where they were at, and primarily our mission, at that point, nobody really knew what Saddam might do when the main offensive of, conventional army, conventional Marine Corps, British, other allies started from the south,
Yeah,
their push towards Baghdad. What would Saddam do? Would he, send his forces in the north against the Kurds to create a destabilizing uh, effect? One, both killing Kurds, but causing Kurds to flee to Syria and Iran, and probably most importantly for people that were planning to Turkey, which would further destabilize the region. So obviously, out of a desire to help protect the Kurds and help stop or prevent something like that from happening, we went in a couple weeks before the actual ground war started. We were in place with the Kurds and started organizing them to defend themselves and do take back the land that they considered theirs, because after you know Desert Storm, the '90s war against Iraq, Saddam had pushed into Kurdish territory and established, what he referred to as his buffer zone. And then, you know, the U.S. had been enforcing a no-fly zone up in the Kurdish areas, but the Kurds had still never been allowed to go back to some of the cities that they considered theirs. So, when we got in there with them, we were able to move Kurds that had been forced out of those towns, moved back into their towns, and our particular sector, we cleared down to Mosul, Iraq, which
mm,
people in the Bible will recognize as the city of Nineveh, or maybe not know that, but yeah. So I was able to go um, drive through the biblical the some of the remains of the city of Nineveh as we got to Mosul, and then once we were there, that was sort of when we told the Kurdish allies that, hey, you guys can go back,
yeah,
go back home, and then at that point, U.S. We were only there a few days before U.S. conventional forces. Now this is a couple months into the war, but U.S. conventional forces made their way up there and started stabilizing the city, and it was probably best to get the Kurdish militia out of there at that point, before things between the Kurds and the Arabs continued to deteriorate. So yeah, but it was a great experience for me being with the Kurds and helping them, sort of move through and retake towns that they had historically lived in, and along the way we passed and were able to clear a Syrian monastery that's on one of the mountains on the route to Mosul. So definitely some history along the way,
yeah.
history lessons along the way.
I had the pleasure of going to Israel last year in August
Okay.
and spent a day in Jerusalem. So we got to go to the Western Wall and so on. And I really appreciated and do appreciate the history and just the awesomeness of being there and touching the the temple and the wall that's been there for so long. And there is so much history over there that I really wish people would more appreciate and on all sides would figure out how they could become better at working with each other. One of these days, there's going to have to be peace, or it's going to really get a whole lot worse very quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was interesting though, when we were there, obviously watching the various groups of Syrians, Kurds, uh, Arabs, and others that had various claims to different parts of Mosul and different parts of the area around it. So it's fascinating, to watch. Um, history try and unwind itself from some of the decisions that were made, post World War II when lines were being drawn in the desert to create countries and the ramifications of that.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have a perspective that's built on a lot of knowledge and being there, which I think is great. Um, on the other hand, well, not on the other hand, but then you left the military. That had to be a major change in terms of what you had been doing and what you were used to after almost 30 years. What's it like when you decide to make that kind of a major change and then in your case go back into civilian life?
Yeah. So my first step wasn't that far away from the military, and I started referred to my first job as sort of an addiction clinic because
Huh,
I went to work
halfway
as
house.
I went to work as a contractor,
Ah,
or a defense contractor. I went back to Afghanistan for about a year and a half, running training programs for some of the Afghan Special Operations Forces. So it was really it was if I was a heroin addict, I was in the methadone clinic, trying
yeah.
trying to get off of it. And then I realized I kind of needed to go home, and my marriage had dissolved, and so I was like, hey, I probably time to like go home and have a different kind of life. And I moved into a civilian job with a friend at the time who was doing investment training around the world, and he's like, hey, I know um, you will travel. There's a lot of people that when I talk to them about the travel, it's involved with our business. They don't really want to do that, and he's like, but I know, from where you're at. And he's like, hey, I'll buy a ticket, fly to Hong Kong, see what our business is about. So I went there and learned about the investment training they were doing in Hong Kong and throughout Southeast Asia. And then they had an office in Johannesburg and, one in London and Canada and the US, and doing all this training. And so for about a year, a little over a year, I worked in that business and learned, the various things that they were doing, how they were teaching people to invest in real estate and stocks and that sort of thing. Started doing it myself, lessons I wish I would have known earlier in my life, but started doing that. And then when I left that company, that's a lot of what I've been doing. I've taken some smaller jobs and smaller contract projects, but by and large, that's basically what I've been doing since then is, working in real estate investing or real estate projects.
And continuing to hone your leadership skills.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I kept continued to work with. I worked a couple of jobs where I was helping people start up businesses. As either in a CEO role or in an operations role to help them start their businesses. So I did some of that, which is always fun. It's great working with new talent and establishing procedures and helping people grow that way. So that was really fun. And then got to be part of a couple of nonprofits, Special Forces Charitable Trust, probably my longest stint. I did that for about 7 or 8 years on the board of directors. Running, helping to develop activities and programs to support our Special Forces veterans. So yeah, it's been fun. And then obviously having a new family and spending a lot of time in my role as a dad has been probably the most rewarding.
Yeah, I bet. And that's always so much fun. And you get to help bring some new people along into the world and
Yeah,
hopefully help to make a difference that way. And on top of that, you continue to study. You're getting a PhD. You mentioned it earlier, but you're getting a PhD in
yeah,
organizational psychology and leadership. There we go with the leadership again.
yeah. It's fun because when I do get the opportunity to speak at events, I move around and speak at different events. I know you do a lot of speaking. You probably do much more than I do. But the events I do speak at, I want to make sure that sometimes being a practitioner of something doesn't always mean that you have the exact language or the academic credentials to go along with being a practitioner. And I've been a practitioner of leadership for so many years, but now studying it and applying, one working towards an academic credential in that says, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about, but then also having uh, the latest developments and studies on leading people effectively and how people are doing it wrong and how you can help them. I think it's been a great journey to be on as well, especially keeping my mind active in all things leadership and helping organizations do it better.
Well, you have been a leader for a long time, but now you're studying it. Would you say that you're also discovering new things along the way? And, I guess what I'm getting at is, of course, none of us are ever so much an expert that we can't afford to learn more things.
Oh yeah, for sure. Both learning new things, learning why I might have done things wrong, based on studies. Like okay, if you have this type of personality, you might do this wrong, or things I was doing right, but not exactly knowing all of the mechanisms that were going into why I was making that decision. But when you look at the psychology behind it, and you look at organizational structures, you look at cultural artifacts within organizations, then you can start to unwind why teams do what they do, why leaders are developed the way they're developed, and why people make certain decisions. And
Yeah.
it's been fascinating, and then also looking back, as you said, back at things that you did, decisions that you made, and what you could have done better, as you looked at through that and how you can help someone else. And that's also really helped me further, synthesize down this way that I look at leading people with love and compassion, and why it's so important to be that servant type of leader. Um, Not just a transformational leader that's trying to transform an organization and move that, but then, how do you serve and care for the people that are going to be part of that transformation?
Yeah. Because if you are just looking at it from the standpoint of being a transformational leader, I'm going to change this organization. That doesn't really work. And
Yeah,
I think that the most important aspect is being a servant leader, is being a person who serves, because that also opens you up to learning along the way and learning how to serve better.
yeah, and as I learned in the many organizations that I was part of over my time in special forces, is just because alluding, when we are discussing roles, and I was saying it's the officer's role to often to plan and to lead, but that the other people are the experts, and that's something, the sooner you embrace that
Yep.
fact, the faster uh, the faster you become effective, and the more effective you are, when you realize that um, understanding the people and caring and serving them, and then getting their best performance, and understanding what they know and what they can do and where you need to put them to maximize their potential, then those things start to become the most important thing that you're doing. How people play against each other, who works well with who, how that works, how that betters the organization. Those are all things that are fascinating, to me, and things that kept me up at night, trying to figure out, how to be more efficient, how to take better care of people, while getting not only getting the best out of them, but them realizing they were giving their best and being happy and proud of what they were doing.
And getting the best out of you as well.
Yeah, yeah. Bringing the best out of them is bringing the best out of me.
Right. So you've done work also in the nonprofit sector. You're continuing to do that.
Yeah,
Tell me.
yeah. Now, after leaving this Special Forces Charitable Trust, I realized, after I moved out to Idaho, where I live now, that I wasn't as connected to the regiment as I'd been when I first retired, and I was still kind of in the North Carolina area. Or, but after moving out here, just felt like that I probably there were other guys more recently retired, knew more of the things that needed to be done. So stepping down from that organization, and then obviously one of the other things that happened was, the the rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops from
Yeah.
Afghanistan and the fall of Afghanistan. And I found myself with many other Afghan veterans sort of, both wondering, what it all meant, why, but then also what we could do, not dwelling too long on, oh, poor me, why did I go? What did it mean? But more so, hey, we had a bunch of people that we made promises to, a bunch of people that fought alongside America. Some certainly, in the interest of Afghanistan, but there were also many of the, especially on the Afghan special operations side, that were not always necessarily doing things at the behest of the Afghan government, but operating with U.S. forces on things that the U.S. wanted to do. But then, we're sort of left hanging when during the withdrawal. So, working alongside other veterans to try and get as many of those people out during the withdrawal, and then but so now I work with an operation or a organization called Operation Recovery that is still following these families, following these cases, people that are either still in Afghanistan, some in hiding, some in other countries illegally, but trying to help them resolve visa issues and either get to Canada or the United States or someplace in Europe, just someplace safe for them and their family away from the Taliban. And so that's been it, and it's hard work, because in work like that, we're trying to make government bureaucracies realize that they should be issuing visas or allowing people to move. It's not always a rapid process, so
Yeah.
often it feels like, and and I'm not pointing fingers as if anyone should still, be completely focused on Afghanistan. But other things happen. Ukraine, the war in Ukraine draws attention away. The war in Israel. Hurricanes, storms, everything that's going on.
So many
Assassination
things.
attempts.
Yeah.
Assassination attempts. All of
Yeah.
that stuff diverts people's. Draws people their attention to that. And I'm not sure many people, they support the troops, and you often hear them, uh, you know, thanking troops for their service. And the only response I can have to that, for years I struggled with how to respond to that when someone would say, "Thank you for your service," just okay, thank you, I don't know, thanks for your support. But I heard a good response, and I've been using it since, and it's like America's worth it. So. Um,
Yeah. On top of everything else that you do, you've also been dabbling or going into real estate a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a lot of what I've been doing, for because providing for your family, right? So yeah, I started doing some investment real estate, and uh, out here got a partner. We did worked on a couple of mobile home parks, larger projects, and I still once a week I still teach a class for people who are learning to invest. And primarily I use the vehicle of learning to invest in mobile manufactured homes, and I do
Mm,
that, as I explain to people, is because it's something that you can learn to do with lower capital.
yeah.
You can go to some of these mobile home parks and you can find one um, cheaper than you would find a home to flip. You can do the renovation cheaper. They're smaller, and so I explain the process of doing that and then the do's and don'ts of how to do it with a manufactured home. And I tell them, it's kind of like this is the gateway drug to real estate, because then, once you learn how to do it with the smaller amount of capital and what timelines look like and how to develop budgets and sell those, then you can move on to maybe putting newer homes in parks or developing your own parks or moving on to homes and other things. But it's something that you can do. And I did several of them, several manufactured homes here when I first moved to Idaho. And my crew were, my construction crew was usually high school boys. So I get, high school boys and, teach them how to lay laminate flooring and, run a paint sprayer and do some of the just the small things that you need to do to make a space livable again. And yeah, it was fun. Get to teach kids, skills and rehab some homes and feel useful. I like working with my hands, so yeah, it was fun. And now I've moved on to some other projects, but yeah, I still teach a class that deals with manufactured housing and real estate investing.
My wife and I, when we did our second home, Karen was in a wheelchair her whole life. And so we bought a home. Our first home was not accessible. We kind of made it accessible enough to work. But when we relocated, we found a subdivision that actually encouraged manufactured homes.
Yeah,
And we learned a lot about manufactured homes and the importance of them and the high quality and everything else. And so we had, oh, what was it? It was about an 1,800 square foot manufactured home in three sections. And I remember um, we actually followed, we didn't even know it was going to happen that way, but we were going down to see the manufactured home be delivered and the three pieces of it be set up where they needed to be set up. And it turns out we followed the home down the freeway, down the interstate for about 50 miles until we got to where it was supposed to go. It was a lot of fun.
yeah, yeah. That's one thing. I think the stigma has held that housing down. People think of trailer parks often in a negative
Yeah,
light.
it's well, and of course, trailers and mobile homes are different than a manufactured home.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the other thing I try to explain. We go through all that terminology, but it's like, in manufactured housing now, is like if you were to go to a city and ask them like what their, number one problem, many cities will talk about, they have an affordable housing crisis, right?
Yeah,
But then if you turn on the other side and said, okay, well, let me put some manufactured homes in here, right? Then their generally their immediate answer is no, right? So it's like,
yeah,
so
they don't understand that those homes really subscribe to incredibly high HUD standards. But
yeah, yeah, and that's yeah. They coming out of the factory, you can guarantee because of the HUD inspectors that are there that all of those houses meet meet pretty demanding standards, and they're
no
built.
no wood shrinkage or any of that
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
all, yeah, that's,
yeah. So
well,
it is fascinating, but there is still this. But I
there's
think
still the stigma.
yeah, but I think as we see prices continue to go up, and certainly with interest rates and prices where they are, I think newer generations are going to turn more and more towards. You're going to see more and more. I think manufactured housing become what starter homes look like for many people.
Which makes a lot of sense. Well,
Yeah.
Fred, I want to thank you for being here and spending all this time with us. We've gone almost an hour and 10 minutes. We done good.
All
But
right.
I really appreciate you being here and I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Fred and what Fred has done. So, Fred, if people want to reach out to you, is there a way they can do that?
Yeah, I have a Substack, guide2human.com, where I write. So you can go on there and read what I'm thinking about and contact me there. And you can find me on Facebook as well, Facebook or Instagram. I'm on there as Fred Dummar. So if you look for me, you can probably find me and see what I'm up to.
Well, I hope people will do that. And we want to hear what all of you out there are up to as well. Especially, we want to hear what you thought of our podcast episode today. So please let me know. I'm easy to reach. It's my email address is Michael Michaelhaelhi at accessibe.com. Michaelhi@accessibe.com. Or you can go to our podcast page, which is www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Michael Hinkson is MichaelHingson.com/podcast. So, however you do it, we'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts. Really appreciate your comments and your input. We appreciate it if you give us a 5-star rating wherever you're observing or dealing with this podcast in any way. We love 5-star ratings, so please do that. We thank you very much for doing it. And for all of you, including you, Fred, if you know of anyone else who might want to be a podcast guest or you have any people in mind that you think ought to be guests, please let us know. We would appreciate hearing about it and inviting them to come on Unstoppable Mindset. So again, Fred, I want to thank you for
Thanks,
being
Michael.
here with us. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate you.